Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Kieran, I don't often get to say this, but it's a relatively quiet week news-wise, so what have you been up to? We can have a chat. Where are you now as we speak? I know that sounds a bit like a sex call, doesn't it? Where are you, Kieran? What are you wearing?
Oh, well, those are the days when I used to answer those calls as well. I'm presently in Liverpool, back teaching, back doing the proper job. And today we're recording this on the Wednesday night. Today is the 43rd anniversary of the release of Down in the Tube Station at Midnight by the Jam. For me, one of the greatest records of all time, but also part of the biggest regret of my life, because I used to go and see the Jam quite often. And I had tickets for their final ever concert, which was taking place in Brighton, because, of course, it was a big mod town. And my kid sister had never seen them, and I gave my ticket to my kid sister so that she could see them. And I've bitterly regretted it never since, and I've never forgiven her.
Well, it was you that did it. You gave it to her, Kieran. She didn't steal it from you, did she?
Well, she didn't, but she could have let me go. Yeah, she sort of cried, and I felt sorry for her. And I'm by all accounts, it was just the greatest gig of all time.
Ah, so you did that terrible thing of offering somebody something, assuming they would say no, it's fine, and they went, "Oh, great, thank you."
Yes.
Yeah, I think, Kieran, we can disagree with people over the rights and wrongs of the Newcastle United deal, but there's no agreeing with anybody who doesn't think that the Jam were probably the best punk band, for want of a better word, of that era. Joy Division, the Smiths, but the Jam were right up there. I never actually got to see them for various reasons, mainly because I kept giving my tickets away to various weeping women as well. But I did have one memorable night out with Paul Weller.
Wow.
I say memorable. I'm still piecing it together from bits of information given to me by people over the central London and Soho area. Yeah, he came to see one of my gigs.
Oh, superb.
And we got chatting, and wow, he's got some. Kieran, you've got some interesting stories. I'm going to suggest that one or two of Paul Weller's trump one or two of yours. Shall we get on with the news now that we've lost half our listeners and the BAFTA nomination panel yet again?
Yes, let's.
We actually got people. It's got to the stage, Kieran, where you publish your mind map as an indication of what we're talking about on the latest pod, and Derby fans are genuinely outraged. Right, you'd think they'd be quite pleased.
Yes, I do.
They're genuinely, seriously, where's Derby?
That question?
But they're in luck this week. I don't know whether this is a definition of optimism or it's what you'd expect them as a desperate last throw of the dice, but Derby County have appealed over their points deduction.
Yes, and this has come as one of the decisions which has been made by the administrators. Under the EFL rules, there is an automatic 12-point penalty for any football club that goes into administration. And if you are going to appeal and it's unsuccessful, you then have to pay the costs of the EFL as well. And I went into the administrator's report for our very good friends at Wigan Athletic, and that cost around about £400,000. Mainly, of course, to our friends of the silver tongue variety. So it is a bit of a gamble, but if Derby are successful, they will see it as they'll get an extra £6 to £7 million in TV money. They'll get a better commercial deal from their front of shirt sponsor next season because they're less likely to be in League One. And also, if you're trying to sell Derby County as a Championship club, you're going to be able to sell it for a higher price than if it's a League One club because you're only one step away from the Premier League. So I suspect the administrators have done their sums. Will they be successful or not? Well, Wigan appealed and were unsuccessful, although the circumstances were slightly different. I've spoken to an insolvency practitioner and said, "What would you do under the circumstances?" And he said, "Well, it's a £400,000 cost for a potential £7 or £8 million gain. So the odds are 20-1. Is it shorter than a 20-1 shot? It probably is, but it's not much shorter in his opinion, because he says, well, there's 71 other EFL clubs that didn't go into administration, so they can't use. They've not been using COVID as an excuse, and I think the argument will be put forward by the administrators that it was all due to COVID and nothing to do with Mel Morris's fairly cavalier approach to running the club when it comes to the finances. So that's where we are. I spoke to a lawyer as well, because I believe there is something called force majeure, which is external factors beyond the expectation of man nor beast. And he said, well, we've had Ebola, we've had SARS elsewhere in the world. The EFL will probably say that they knew, and scientists have been saying that at some point in time there was going to be another global health crisis, and therefore that's going to help the EFL rather than the Derby County administrators. But it's a punt. It's an expensive punt, but if it comes off, there'll be high fives and trebles all round, in the administrators, and also from the point of view of the Derby County fans themselves.
The force majeure argument is interesting because there aren't many theatre companies or people in my industry who could afford to pay for the force majeure clause in an insurance policy. But those that did are finding that insurance companies are saying this doesn't count. COVID doesn't count, as you say. It's neither an act of God or something that couldn't be foreseen. So it'll be interesting to see how the EFL. But who actually hears this appeal, Kieran? Is it an independent committee or is it the EFL themselves?
No, it will be dealt with by an independent body, and there will normally be 3 legal experts. There could be 1 financial expert, but there's normally a panel of 3. The aim is to get this resolved as quickly as possible, because it has a huge implications in terms of the price that the administrators can negotiate with the potential buyer. So there is a special sort of sport arbitration service, and that's both cheaper and quicker than going to the courts. And that will be the course of action that will be undertaken by both parties.
Now, I almost hesitate to say this, Kieran, on behalf of Derby fans and indeed of Newcastle United fans, but these rumours have been spreading, as tends to happen in these days of social media. And I don't know if there's any truth to them or whether people are putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 5. But is there any chance that Mike Ashley will now decide that Derby County is a lovely, cheap football club option that he can add to his portfolio without half the trouble? I mean, he could, if he buys Derby County, as people are speculating, it won't cost him much money to get them out of trouble. And Derby fans will probably love him for the rest of their life, won't they?
Well, the administrators have said that there has been no contact with Mike Ashley. But if you take a look at his history of buying distressed assets and distressed brands, he knows where value is. I think the challenge for whoever ends up buying Derby County, and I think people are far more positive than they were perhaps a couple of weeks ago that there will be a successful resolution here, is that there's 2 issues. A, there's the purchase price of buying the club from the administrators, and then B, there's the costs of operating in the EFL Championship, where we've said it's a car crash of a division. You've got clubs coming down from the Premier League, you've got clubs coming up from League One, you've got the hardy perennials. The average losses are, I think I worked out $476,000 a week. Is Mike Ashley willing to underwrite those losses, or is he going to try to operate the club on a similar way to the way that he ran Newcastle, which was to try to run it financially on an even keel. In which case, it's very difficult to get out of that division. If you're heading upwards, it's a lot easier to get out of that division and head towards League One, which isn't good news.
But he's just trousered 300 million quid, Kieran, isn't he? Or he's about to.
Yes, but he will be looking for value. And is there value in entering an industry where 80% of the companies in that industry are losing money? He's historically taken over brands which have fallen upon hard times. He's sold those brands cheaply with new products and has managed to find a market for them. Is there the equivalent in football? I'm not so sure.
I've always loved the phrase hardy perennials. I know it's to do with gardening, but it always sounds to me like something Sid James should get in a Carry On film. This is an interesting one. A group of players, and I think one ex-manager as well, are looking for compensation over what they call data misuse.
Yes, this is coming via the Global Sports Data and Technology Group Limited, which sounds very grand until you go onto Companies House and you find that the company is owned by two blokes, one of whom is the former Brighton Hove Albion manager, Russell Salad. And his real name's Russell Slade, but one of our fans claims that he once saw him in a kebab shop and he was ordering a kebab, and what it's like, do you want any salad on that, sir? No, please, I want more meat. So since ever then he's been known as Russell Salad amongst us fans.
Kieran, if any team was going to have a manager called Salad, it would be Brighton. Let's face it. If there's an Italian manager out there called Quinoa, he'll be next on your list. Giuseppe Quinoa. Brighton will have him.
So this is all to do with players' personal details and the number of passes and tackles they make, the number of shuttles, the number of interceptions, the number of successful completions. There are data analytical companies that A, harvest that data, and B, they sell it on to other parties. Now, the argument put forward by Russell Slade and his colleagues is that this is a breach of GDPR rules, Global Data Recognition, in respect of personal data, which is able to identify you as an individual. And it also includes sort of physical attributes such as the height of the player. Now, Russell Slade said that some of the data which is being put out in the public domain or sold by these organisations is wrong, which could have a detrimental effect on clubs that are recruiting. So you might be looking for a centre half who is the minimum of 6'2", and if the people that have put the data together have said that you're 6'1" incorrectly, that could have a negative impact upon your career. So they have sent, I think, letters of intent to 17 organisations, and this will include the likes of the computer game manufacturers. FIFA is a huge game at present. And this is, I think, the lawyer they're using is a guy called Chris Farnell, who we have discussed before. I think he was involved in part of the rather uncomfortable actions taking place at Charlton, and we'll come round to that story a little bit later.
We will.
But how far should this go? Because what happens if in a TV commentary, one of the commentators says that was an excellent interception by such and such a player, and somebody says, well, actually, it wasn't a very good interception, and we get differences of opinion. Now, I spoke to a lawyer who, and I quote, says, the lawyer said, it's quite a stretch to say that this is covered under the GDPR rules. But it's an interesting argument, which, in his opinion, was unlikely to succeed, which I think is a legal phrase for he thinks it's a load of bollocks.
Right, okay. It's a very 21st century problem, Kieran, isn't it? Because we've discussed recently that increasingly clubs are rejecting the traditional scouting approach and going for a very much data-based analysis of incoming players. So if they argue that the stats incorrectly state a player's height or weight or number of passes, you can understand why they'd be upset. But does this include the figures that the stats at Sky, for example, would use, or the BBC will trot out for every game?
Yes, I think it is, because and quite often we're seeing in the pre-match analysis, it will be, N'Golo Kante has made 74 successful interceptions this season, has a pass completion rate of 86%. The argument put forward by Global Sports Data and Technology is that actually belongs to the player. Although, again, when I spoke to the lawyer, he said, well, the player's not put together those numbers. So therefore, it doesn't belong to the player. It's just an observation by other parties. And ultimately, that's an opinion on the player. So, I think it's a bit of a punt in the dark in terms of the success of it. But, I'm not accusing Mr. Farnell of being an ambulance chaser with regard to this, of course, but it does seem a bit of a long shot.
We've discussed this before, Kieran, about if you could keep the tone of your voice consistent with what you're not accusing people of, that would be wonderful, especially for producer guy who panics about the legal side of things. I mean, the Premier League released some monthly stats a few days ago, one of which was that Tyrick Mitchell, Palace's young left-back, has had the most successful tackles in the Premier League so far this season. So why would Tyrick Mitchell be upset about that knowledge being public?
Well, I suspect he isn't. The data can be used on both a positive and a negative. And remember when Kevin De Bruyne went in to negotiate a new contract
yes, indeed,
with Manchester City, he used the data to generate for himself a pretty significant pay rise on the back of that, because it showed just what a huge contribution he makes to Manchester City in terms of not just goals but assists and start-offs of moves which result in goals as well. So I guess it's a case of who has ownership of that data. Is it the player or is it the analytics company? Because presumably Kevin De Bruyne had to pay the analytics company for that data to help him in his negotiations.
That's interesting, isn't it? Even though it's him that did all those things. Yeah, I'd quite like somebody to do a heat map of this pod occasionally. I think it'd be quite consistent week in, week out. You would occasionally get up to let Finley out. And apart from that, I think people will say, yeah, actually, across the season, these guys are really, really solid with their stats. Barnsley, a club we don't talk about a lot on this pod, which is a good sign, but they have closed the West Stand at Oakwell.
Yes, this is rather weird. I mean, the West Stand is sort of the main stand at Barnsley, and again, as an away fan, it's one of those grounds you really enjoy going to. My first trip there was November 1981, where it was a League Cup match, but it was a big, in the days when the League Cup was a big competition. We took the lead after 2 minutes, and then a Mick McCarthy inspired Barnsley absolutely hammered us 4-1. And me and the fellow 44 Brighton fans who were there that evening went home with our tails between our legs.
I love Barnsley, but I think Barnsley is one of the best badges in world football. It's hard to explain, but you look it up and you'll see. I just love the solid working chap standing on each side of it. It's great. It's a great badge.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, traditionally, again, they're the sort of club that are overlooked. They're the sort of club that are I'm not patronising them there, but are the kind of backbone of the EFL, the sort of club that every other fan doesn't resent them getting a season in the Premier League, but it's always nice to know that they're there.
Absolutely. So the West Stand, it's got a capacity of 4,500 people. I think there's around about 1,000 season tickets holders there. The director's box is there, so you would assume that it's a decision which has not been taken lightly. But then you sort of dig a little bit further, and it turns out that Barnsley don't own Oakwell. It is
Ah,
jointly owned by the former family who owned the ground and the local council. Now, the local council have come out and said they have surprise and disappointment with the closure of the West End because they inspected it on the 21st of September, and as far as they were concerned, there was nothing wrong with it.
uh-huh.
Whereas Barnsley are saying they've had a structural report which has forced them to close the stand. And digging a bit deeper, the relatively new owners of Barnsley, they're not over happy with the position. They're presently paying rent of 150 grand a year, which I don't think is excessive for a football ground. £3 a week. That's probably far less than they're paying the vast majority of their players in the Championship.
Yeah.
But there does appear to be a bit of needle between the current owners, the former owners, and the council, because in addition, the North Stand at Barnsley, which is where the visiting fans go, and that's one of the it's the end behind one of the goals. And depending upon who the opposition are, it's one of those stands where you might get a third of it or 2/3 of it, of all of it. That holds 5,000, but they've reduced the capacity there to 2,000, which seems to be sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face, because I think their next opponents at Oakwell are Sheffield United, who you'd think would probably sell it out. It's
of course.
a big local derby, but I think they've had issues in trying to get stewards this season. So it's I think it's all to do with fights and disputes at executive level. The new owners have said they are not averse to finding themselves a new place in which to play football. But is that a case of, are they trying to put pressure on the council and the former owners? There's more to this than meets the eye. I would hate it. Oakwell's it's just a fantastic place to go to for anybody that's familiar with the history and heritage of football in this country. I think it would be a real shame if they ended up leaving. And let's just hope that they can resolve their differences.
Well, as you say, Kieran, it sounds a bit like brinkmanship. Is it also a little bit like the Birmingham City situation where landlord and tenant can't agree who should be paying for upgrades on the ground?
Yes. I suspect that there is an element of that. Presumably the new owners have plans, and they do seem to be quite progressive in some ways. Certainly, they are big supporters of the Moneyball style of football, and they're punching above their weight at present. So we'll have to wait and see. But as we've said on many times on the show, the separation of football club from football stadium is often leading to not good vibes.
Now, Kieran, you and I and most of our listeners are aware that when it comes to rivalries, Crystal Palace only really acknowledge one proper rivalry, and that's with what Danny Dyer would describe as your mob. But I'm also aware that Charlton fans have some beef with Crystal Palace, and they think we have a rivalry. It doesn't go much beyond them calling us Palace and us calling them Clownton. So it's not banter. It's not banter on a Dorothy Parker level. But even if I had the biggest rivalry with Charlton fans, I would applaud them for what they've done this week, because a bunch of Charlton fans have launched the Charlton Dossier website, and Rochdale fans are going to be interested in this. And that website chronicles every detail of the 9 months that ESI owned the club. And as far as I'm concerned, this is fan action, brilliantly executed.
It is. And for anybody who wants to get chapter and verse with regards to what's happened to Charlton over the course of the last couple of years, I think it's essential reading. So ESI stands for East Street Investments, and which was a company which was set up, and it bought Charlton And again, it's a case of be careful what you wish for, because Charlton's previous owner, Roland Duchâtelet, he was very unpopular with
Wow, was he
with
just? Yeah.
Charlton fans, and you can understand their beef. One of the individuals who were part of East Street Investments was a guy called Matt Southall, and there is a Netflix show, there is a documentary to be produced in relation to what happened at Charlton, because it's pure soap opera. There were Matt Southall lives in Dubai most of the time, but he also has a house in, I believe, in Worsley in Manchester. And he was then involved, in theory, with trying to buy a quarter of the shares of Rochdale Football Club. It's estimated for around about £200,000. He had a Zoom meeting with Rochdale Supporters Trust. I think it's fair to say that meeting on Zoom did not go down particularly well. I think the trust felt that his assurances were somewhat non-existent in terms of his intentions. It sounded like he was just purely trying to buy the shares to make money out of them. If you take a look at what happened with Mr. Southall and Charlton, if you just Google Matt Southall, Charlton, and a Range Rover, you'll probably find what you're looking for. And fair play to the people behind Charlton dossier, because they went a digging. And then they found that there was a court judgment against Mr. Southall with regards to unpaid bills for his residence in Worsley. Unpaid, it looks like a building contractor had done work there, and the court was in favour of the building company. £43,000 of work. There was interest on top. There were legal fees on top. So I think they were quite rightly pointing out, if he can't go and pay for work done on his house, how is he going to go and spend 200 grand on shares at Dale, and then presumably give them some form of budget in which to compete in League Two, because they've not had the greatest of starts this particular season. So it's a fascinating read. It's further indication to me that I think football fans are underestimated. There is a viewpoint that we're just a bunch of oiks, and if the club goes and signs a new number 9, we can be placated. But the degree of detail that the people behind the Charlton dossier have gone into, the timeline, the professionalism included in the website is something to be applauded.
Well, also Charlton have got a brilliant tradition of direct action, if you like. They started their own political party to get themselves back to the Valley.
Yeah,
and it worked. So this is a brilliant resource for Rochdale fans, basically. So I imagine that Charlton fans and Rochdale fans are speaking to each other, and hopefully they will succeed. But as you say, Kieran, you underestimate football fans at your peril, because you put us up against a wall and they'll come out fighting, not in clever ways like this.
Yeah,
we're better than you are, is what I'm saying to people like. I'm not even going to say his name. Cambridge, again, another club we very rarely talk about, but their chief executive, Ian Mather, has said that there should be a tougher regulation of FFP rules.
Yes, and Cambridge United are one of the clubs that have signed up to Fair Game, which is a lobbying group, and we had Niall from Fair Game on the show a few months ago. Cambridge United have done really well. They were promoted from League Two to League One, and I think Ian Mather, I think he's the chief exec or the chairman, he said, in his opinion, there are clubs gambling with the future of the club. And he said a few things about Derby, about the way that they were being run, which, again, I'll let people read for their own rights. But I think you can probably guess he wasn't particularly glowing in his praise. But I think some of the things which he's suggested, that there should be some form of real-time monitoring, i.e. the EFL have access to all of the club's bank accounts so they can see how much money is going out on a regular basis. That would be good. He's very much in favour of an ombudsman who can come in and act quickly. And he one of his comments of, there seem to be some clubs, I hate to think who he's thinking of here, who are indulging in clever accounting, but it's not that clever if it puts the future and the existence of the club at stake. So, he's come out all guns blazing. Cambridge United's budget for League One is £500,000 more than in League Two. They think that they can survive on that. It's one of the lowest budgets in League One, and we know. We've also spoken to our friend Andy Holt about the challenges of being in League One, but I think the spending in that division this season has been unusually high. Cambridge United, I think their highest scorer last season, he ended up going to Wrexham in the National League because Wrexham, who are a National League team, have blown Cambridge United, a League One team, out of the water in terms of wages. So it's football. You would think football would learn from prior problems, but it still has an ability to spend money that it doesn't have.
So one of my favourite ever away games was at Cambridge. I didn't even get in. But it was still one of the best days. It's when we beat them in the quarter-final of the FA Cup in 1990, when, along with a lot of brash South Londoners who didn't have tickets, we thought, we'll just go down, be fine, we'll get one outside. There'll be a tout. There was no tout. And we still had a brilliant day. And also, what I love about Cambridge United is that Max Rushton, brilliant TalkSport host, very funny, very intelligent, still gets apoplectic with fury every time I mention Jeff Thomas's 25-yard screamer that beat them, which he reckons was a 9-yard bobbler. But there you go. And speaking of FFP, and Max Rushton, I think even he would forgive me for saying this is on a slightly higher level. The president of La Liga, Javier Tebas, has accused Paris Saint-Germain of getting around FFP rules again.
Yes, Javier Tebas, I think, is the king of whataboutery. In the sense that you would think his focus would be on Spanish football, but like clockwork, practically every month he has found something to gripe about in respect of clubs from other countries who might just happen to be have a higher profile or being more successful than clubs in La Liga. So this is in respect of Paris Saint-Germain, and he says they're cheating FFP. He does not hold back. I try to be measured in some of my comments because I am mindful of producer guys' slight twitchiness when we say something which is a bit more direct. But he's come out and he says, well, you just got to look at their recruitment. How on earth can they pay the wages of all these players? And therefore they must be cooking the books in some way. But certainly, if you take a look at the behaviour of PSG over the course of the summer, they've signed Ramos, they've signed Messi, they've signed Wijnaldum, big players on big contracts. But all of those three players were signed on Bosmans. So I've always said that when you sign a player, you look at the total cost, which is going to be the amortization of the transfer fee plus the wages. If you're signing players on Bosmans, and yes, I know people will say, well, hold on, they've also signed Hakimi for €60 million, but that's broadly what they have spent over the course of the summer in terms of fees. And if he signed a 5-year contract, that's only $12 million a year in amortization. So he thinks that PSG are up to something, and of course PSG famously said no to Real Madrid's overtures for signing Kylian Mbappe because they want to win the Champions League themselves, and they have owners who can afford to allow them to do so. So, does PSG have some very lucrative sponsorship arrangements with companies based in the Middle East, and of course their owners are based in Qatar? Yes, they do. But that's business.
It's it's almost a slight dampener to excited Newcastle fans, but PSG are the classic example of illustrating that throwing money at a problem doesn't necessarily solve it, because whatever they're doing, whatever they're up to, they're still not winning the Champions League, are they?
No. I mean, they've become regular participants in the final stages, which is far greater achievement than their initial years. But and the two Middle Eastern backed clubs, Manchester City and PSG, have run precisely 0 Champions Leagues between them. So, the likes of Tebas, I think he's being a bit harsh, but I think his nose was put out of joint, because there is a belief held that if Real Madrid comes for one of your players, you just say, well, it's the greatest club in the world, and off you go with a merry wave. And PSG,
absolutely, of course.
They stuck to their guns and said, he signed for us for another year. We're quite happy to allow Kylian Mbappe to continue to play with us, and there's no evidence of him sulking, as perhaps has been the case with some other high-profile players who didn't get the move they were looking for over the course of the summer.
And still at the level of stellar football clubs, our penultimate story takes us to Barcelona, who will be playing away from the Nou Camp for a year while the stadium is being developed. Is that going to have a massive effect on matchday income?
Well, yes, it is, because in a normal year, Barcelona would look to get around about 130 million from matchday revenues even. And it looks as if they are going to be moving out of the Camp Nou in the summer of 2022. This season, the local government has just given them final approval to have full capacity for the remainder of their matches, assuming that COVID is not going to have some form of resurgence. But this just appears to be very weird, because it was only a few weeks ago that people were saying, had Barcelona been a listed company, had it not been owned by its members, that it would have gone into administration itself. And now we're talking about a massive capital expenditure infrastructure spend. So again, further indication that football as an industry, it's a bit like watching Men in Black, that somebody, something bad happens, somebody comes along with a magic pen, and you just forget all the bad news, and you go again spending money as if it was going out of fashion.
And our final story, Kieran, brings us to a subject we've spoken about every week for several months now, I think, and that's gambling. Felipe Hernandez of Sporting Kansas City has been suspended for the remainder of the season for betting on MLS matches.
Yes, and I think the reason why the story, it is a financial story, but also for anybody that saw the program about Paul Merson's battles with his addiction to gambling.
Wow, yeah.
Can only be disturbed that this is happening far too often in football. And in fact, one of the stats that Paul Merson came out with, that he's spoken to the PFA and also other people, and if you are a professional footballer, you are 3 times as likely to suffer from gambling addiction than a member of the general public. But in respect of Hernandez, he was found to be to be gambling on MLS matches, not matches in which he was playing in, but this is where it turns a little bit uncomfortable. He'd run up huge debts and remember, gambling's still illegal in many places in the United States.
Yeah.
So therefore, who do you gamble with? You gamble with Tio Terry, shall we call him, rather than Uncle Terry. And these people, if you don't pay off your gambling debts, these people can turn nasty. So he actually approached the MLS himself and confessed to what he'd done, and with a view to getting some form of protection, because he genuinely feared for his personal safety, and he's admitted to an addiction. So he has now been suspended. He is sort of going through some form of rehabilitation. But if anybody's familiar with the history of American sports, especially baseball, there was evidence of matches being fixed to satisfy the desires of certain families going back, who were making an awful lot of money out of gambling. And this, in my opinion, is further evidence that regulated gambling is a necessity, because if it goes to some form of prohibition, which I'm opposed to, then the people who get involved can be quite unpleasant.
Yeah, I would urge everybody listening to this to watch the Paul Merson documentary. And while you're watching it, you may be aware of Paul Merson as a footballer. You may be aware of him as the chap on Sky Sports who occasionally gets foreign names wrong, and they all laugh at him. He's one of the nicest people you can meet, Paul Merson. He's a genuinely nice fella. And that makes it even harder to watch him talk about his struggles so honestly. And of course, what happens is the problem with gambling leads to problems with other things as well. It leads to alcohol. It leads to substance abuse, because you're so worried about the effect that the gambling has. And it's this whole package. So do watch it, and do remember that he's a nice guy. And also, there's so many other people in football that are probably struggling like that. And that's why it's one or two people have said to us recently that we talk about gambling in sport too much. I don't think we can do that. And that documentary is one of the reasons why, I think, Kieran.
Absolutely.
So anyway, that's our pod for this week. We'll be back, of course, on Monday with our questions pod. And if you have any questions you'd like to be answered on that show, or in about a year's time when we get through the backlog, then email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. And if you would like to make a small monthly contribution to our pod, then please go to patreon.com/priceoffootball. And we would welcome any contributions to our always free to air pod, which is coming up to episode what soon, Kieran? 200?
This is episode 195, I believe,
Crikey.
according to my spreadsheet.
Well, if it's on your spreadsheet, Kieran, I'm not going to argue with that. And of course, we are looking to do something special for our 200th episode. It may well be that we revert to our normal plan, which is the long ball of a quiz, but we are looking to do something special. In the meantime, for tonight, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary farewell.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thanks to everybody for allowing us to do 195 shows. It's only because of your continued interest, because myself and Kevin, I think we've said this honestly. When we first met, we didn't know each other. Producer Guy effectively put us together, and we looked at each other and said, "This is going to last 3 weeks, and we're going to run out of material, and we're going to have no listeners, and it's going to be just like one of those holiday romances which you just try to block out from your memory for the rest of your life." But thanks for your continued support. Patreon is one way of showing your support, but you don't have to do that. If you just go on to the Amazon app, and if you can give us a 5-star review, you can write whatever you want. It helps on the business side of things. It helps us in the charts, and we are trying to get as many diverse guests from different areas of the sport. And the first thing they do, if they don't know who we are, is that they go and look and say, well, is this show actually worth appearing on? So it certainly helps us. Other than that, stay safe and look after yourselves.
Those first few weeks did seem like we were part of some kind of bizarre social experiment, didn't it?
Yes, it
By
did.
Producer Guy, that we were being observed from outside the windows of the pub. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you soon. We won't. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The price of football. The price of football.